In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about orderliness and industriousness.
So here's some distinctions between orderliness and industriousness. You guys can decide where you fit on these. So if you're orderly, you don't leave your belongings around. You like order. That's an unsurprising one. You keep things tidy. You follow a schedule. You're bothered by messy people. You want everything to be just right. You're bothered by disorder. You like routine. You see that rules are observed and you want every detail taken care of. So the other thing you can kind of understand likely is that orderly people aren't that much fun. And I also think that's relevant because, people have different kinds of social value, right? And sometimes you value people because of their ability to contribute, perhaps from an economic perspective, because they're hard workers and they're productive. But, you think about comedians. Comedians have a fairly high social value as far as I'm concerned, but the probability that they're orderly as a class is pretty much zero. Those people are high in extroversion, clearly, low in agreeableness, generally speaking, because you're just not going to make rude comments about people to get a laugh, which is what comedians do at least 50% of the time, unless you're disagreeable. And they have to be pretty low in conscientiousness, because really, a conscientious comedian, it's just not going to happen. The lifestyle doesn't lend itself to that, right? It's erratic. Your employment is going to be erratic. The probability that you're going to be regularly employed is low. You're up at night all the time. You're always partying, because that's the milieu that you're in, And then you might think the same about people who are artistic performers, like musicians. If you want to be a rock musician, for example, when you're a teenager, of course, that makes you just a typical teenager in some ways. But if you're going to pursue that into adulthood, there's many more stable occupations that you have to forego. And you have to be willing to adopt the rather erratic and unpredictable lifestyle that would go along with being, say, a traveling musician. And that also has to not make you feel bad. And, we don't exactly know what makes people industrious or conscientious, but avoiding feeling bad seems to have something to do with it, except that it's complicated, because the hypothesis fundamentally behind the Big Five trait analysis is that all the negative emotions load together on a single factor, right? So that's fundamentally neuroticism. So then you might say, well, if it's neuroticism that all the negative emotions are loading on, what's left over for the conscientious people to use to feel bad with? And we think that conscientiousness isn't a well understood dimension. It's understood from a measurement perspective. We can measure it quite accurately, but mostly only using questionnaires, either self-report or other person's report. We don't have any direct measures of industriousness. And so that's kind of strange, because it's such a potent phenomena that you'd think that you could come up with lab tasks that industrious people, for example, would do a better job at than non-industrious people. But we haven't been able to identify one, and we probably screened 50 to 75 different tasks. Never got any effect at all. With orderliness, though, we've had more luck, because what orderliness seems to be associated with, although not overwhelmingly powerfully, is disgust sensitivity. And so disgust seems to be an emotional axis that's distinct to some degree from neuroticism. And, you might say, well, the disgusting things, if you're too close to a disgusting thing, you'd also get anxious. And I think that's probably true. But the emotion of disgust isn't the same as the emotion of anxiety or the emotion of pain. Disgust is a revulsion emotion. It's a get away from me emotion. Sometimes it's an emotion that will elicit anger, defensive anger, to push something disgusting away, or to be contemptuous of it, or to roll your eyes at it. Now, here's an interesting little fact. One of the best predictors of impending divorce is eye rolling. So if you have a couple in therapy and you notice that when one talks, the other rolls their eyes, you know that that's just not very good. So that's something to remember in your own relationships. If you're starting to roll your eyes at your partner, you might think, well, that's a contempt response. That's a disgust response. If you're starting to do that, then it's either time to stop or time to start looking for a new partner. So now the orderliness-disgust connection turns out to be theoretically extremely interesting, and we're going to talk about that in some detail as we move forward. But I'll go through industriousness next. And so an industrious person carries out their plans. Now, that might be the critical element of industriousness. So if you look at the general neuropsychological literature, what you generally derive from that is that the prefrontal cortex is involved in behavioral regulation, because the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that people use to generate plans. And dorsolateral prefrontal cortical function is primarily cognitive, at least insofar as we've been able to measure it. And the cognitive abilities of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex appear to be quite tightly linked to fluid intelligence, as we discussed before. And so it also stands to reason to some degree that your ability to plan and your intelligence might be associated with your ability to carry out your plans or not to waste time. And the cortex overall has been viewed as an organ that inhibits impulsivity, but as we've discussed, the idea that impulsivity is inhibited is probably not the world's most sophisticated idea. It's probably more that impulsivity is unnecessary if you've developed a sufficiently sophisticated personality, because you can get what you need to have through more complex and sophisticated means with less social conflict. But anyways, there's this idea that's been maintained in the neuropsychological literature for a very long time that the ability to plan is associated with increased control over impulsivity. But the problem with that theory is that it doesn't seem to be true. So there's no correlation. The correlation between intelligence and industriousness is zero. And that's weird because, man, if you take intelligence and correlate it with something, it's correlated with almost everything. So even disgust sensitivity, if we measure disgust sensitivity, and there's a variety of ways of doing that, what we find is more intelligent people are less disgust sensitive. So even, and the connection there is by no means obvious, right? Because you could just as easily think that intelligent people would be less or would be more disgust sensitive. But that isn't how it is. Now, the idea of carrying out your plans, that's an interesting one, because think about what cognition is like, especially abstract cognition of the kind that we were talking about last class. In order to abstract, you have to separate the objects of your internal manipulation from the world, right? So here's an example. So when you go to sleep at night, there's a little switch, for lack of a better term, that shuts your body down. And so what happens is that when you're dreaming, of course you're dreaming about running around, and you move your eyes while you're dreaming. Now, it turns out that the motor systems that control your eyes aren't shut down, because who cares? You can move your eyes and still be in bed asleep, not running around in your dream. But if you take a cat or another animal and you destroy that off switch, the cat will run around and act out its dreams. Okay, so its thinking is linked to its behavior so integrally that when it runs a simulation, it's going to act it out. Now, human beings don't do that. What happens when we think, or we often don't do that, there are times when we can avoid doing that. When you think, you sit there, you generate up your world of abstraction, you have your abstract representations, and you manipulate them. And so you might think, well, this is what I'm going to do tomorrow. You run a simulation in your head. But you wouldn't be able to do that if you couldn't pull the simulated you away from the actual you, right? You have to divorce the representation from the thing it's representing in order to manipulate it abstractly. So that opens up the possibility that you can think through things perfectly well without ever enacting your plans.